Ready to cut out the vacuum wrap of the transition section, and what we're going to do is first we're going to trim it out along the outside edge just so that we can lay it flat on our table. And what we want to do is we want to remove the section that hangs down, and we can do this from the inside. Just run your X-Acto knife along the inside edge, and again, always use the sharpest hobby knife you have when working with the vacuum wraps. Just work slowly to get rid of this edge. After you're done with the preliminary trimming, the wrap should lay flat on the table, but there still should be an edge that extends past each of the ribs. We're now ready to cut out the transition wrap. Unlike the other wraps, this one does not have a raised lip that we can use to guide our knife. So what we're going to do is, instead of cutting at a high angle like this, we're going to cut at a low angle. And we're going to allow the blade of the knife, the back edge, to kind of follow the ribs on the wrap. And we want to be right up against those ribs, and just cut like you would the other ones. Just kind of lightly, gently cut, and you can feel as you pass each rib. And then we're going to bend it back just like the other ones, and as you can tell, it will snap off. To trim the straight edges, what we're actually going to do is to trim a little bit away from the ribs, and we're going to trim it actually a little long, and we'll come back and shorten it up a little bit later after we position it onto the transition of the second to third stage. So go ahead and lay your ruler along the rib and then slowly move it forward, and then trim along the ruler. It's probably not a perfect cut right now, but when we position it onto the transition, we'll adjust it for a perfect fit. We'll now take the wrap and place it onto the transition section. To position it, we want the back edge just hanging over the transition section that we had glued underneath. So make sure it is all the way aligned all around the perimeter. And then we're going to check the fit by overlapping right here. Mine is a little bit long on the bottom, and it's also a little bit long on the top. So now I'll take it and trim the plastic. And again, I'll check the fit. And still a little bit long on the top. So instead of cutting straight across, now I'm going to angle this slightly to trim a little bit more on the top than on the bottom. now looks like my fit is pretty good. We're going to tape the ends together, and we're going to use the same technique as we used on the other wraps. And we're going to use thin CA glue along the edges to tack the edges down, and then CA along the seam. So before you put the CA on, just double check to make sure that the wrap is in the right position. And we're ready to CA. The seam line right here is actually on position 1 of the rocket, and it will be kind of camouflaged when we paint the rocket because one side will be white and one side will be black, and the line will just kind of fade away. From the die cut rings, there should have been 2 discs left over. One disc is slightly larger than the other. We're going to take this disc and glue it on the back side of the coupler section, and just use ordinary wood glue for this. We'll now cut out the vacuform wraps for the third stage. We want the wraps to lay flat on the table, so we'll first remove the outside lip. And we can do this from the inside. Just take your X-Acto knife and just run it along the corner of the sheet. We'll start by separating the 2 wraps and the tunnel covers from the sheet. The short wrap is towards the back end of the third stage, and the long wrap is towards the front, with the flat section at the very front edge of the tube. We'll start with the forward wrap. Again, as with the other wraps, we'll cut from the back side, and you can see we're going to run our knife blade along this corner right here. At first we'll just score along the corner, and then we'll crack it in half to remove the excess plastic. Just work slowly and take your time so that your blade does not stray away from the corner of the wrap. Where your blade goes over these antennas, it it does help to tilt the wrap forward slightly so you can keep your blade in the corner. And we'll also do the same on the back edge. On the edges, we're again going to run our blade along the corner, and when we're finished, the wrap will be a little bit long, but we'll trim it later. And we'll use the same technique on the short wrap that goes on the back of the stage. When you get to the raised areas, as I said before, tilt the sheet upward so you can keep your blade along the corner. On the tunnel covers, let's first separate them in the middle. And again, we're going to cut from the back side. These are a little bit more difficult to cut, but if you tilt them to the side, you can get in there with your hobby knife and get it along that corner. The vacuum forming process can sometimes be a little inconsistent. You may notice that your tunnel cover has a little curve to it. If it does, it's going to be hard to cut with a hobby knife. So in this case, we're going to use a cuticle scissors with a curved end, and this will allow us to get as close as possible into the corner. After the tunnels have been cut out, we're going to fill them totally up to the top with the Fix-It epoxy clay. So go ahead and mix an equal blob of both parts A and part B and fill the back side of the tunnels and try to keep them as smooth as possible. We're going to come back later and sand the back flat and then sand off the radius sides. We're going to be able to make a really nice tunnel cover, even though it doesn't look like it's any good at this point. As you can see, I have one of the tunnels filled already, and it's filled a little bit high. I did that on purpose so that I can sand it smooth later and get a nice flat surface. And we'll go ahead and do the same thing with the long tunnel. Press it all the way into the corners, and don't be afraid to let it ooze over the edges. We can just trim that off a little bit later before it has a chance to set up. I'm next going to take a sheet of plastic, such as a bag from a grocery store or a sandwich bag, and I'm going to turn the tunnel covers over and press them hard against the plastic. What this does is it's going to give us a flat surface on the backside, and it's going to kind of keep the tunnels from curving upward. And then go ahead and just allow the epoxy to cure, and it's probably going to take about 3 or 4 hours, and good 24 hours for a complete hardening. When the epoxy has dried, we're going to sand off the edges. We're going to sand them square, and then we're going to sand the bottom smooth. And for this we want to use some very rough sandpaper because the epoxy is very hard. And now we'll sand the bottom smooth. And now we can switch to some finer sandpaper to clean up the edges. So by starting out with something that looked pretty ugly, we can actually turn it into a nice looking part that will look great on the rocket. So go ahead and do the same thing for the larger tunnel cover. We'll be installing the aft wrap onto the third stage first. But before we can install it, we need to know how to orient it on the rocket. This edge here, opposite of these short ribs, will be the front edge. This back edge will butt up against the transition. The position 1 line on this wrap is right in the middle of this flat area here. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that. I'm going to do both the front and the back. Again, here's our position 1 line on the vacuform wrap. If you recall, on the transition, the position 1 line was the seam on the transition. So we're going to take that wrap and position that along the seam. And while holding that in position, we'll check the fit. And as you can see on this one, I have an overlap. What I'm going to do, on one side of the overlap, I'm going to cut it off just past the one rib. Right there. And on the other side, I'm going to cut right between the two little ribs. So we'll take our ruler, we'll lay it on the wrap, and we'll make our trimming cut right there. And on the other end, we're going to trim right between the two end ribs. Now our wrap should be trimmed to length, and we'll again wrap it around the tube. There's our position 1 line on the seam. Wrapping it around the tube, we'll draw it tight together and tape it in position. And we'll just rotate just to make sure that we have position 1 in the right location. We'll now create a line extending from the middle of the flat area. If you look right there here at the rib, we want to extend the line forward from that rib all the way to the top of the body tube. And again, we'll have to use our aluminum angle. We'll lay it along the tube. And we'll draw that line up to the top of the tube. On the forward wrap, before we wrap it around the tube, we're going to trim off the one end closest to this little raised bump, which is actually an antenna. So take your ruler, and we're going to trim about 1 millimeter away from this one little rib on the end. As we wrap it around the tube and align the ends, we're going to pull it tight, and we can use a pencil to draw a line on the wrap where we need to make our cut. Again, just double check the fit to make sure the edges come together and there's no gaps underneath the edges of the wrap. And now we can tape the ends together, and we're going to rotate it to where the middle of the flat area is centered right on the line that we drew on the tube, and then we'll slide the wrap all the way to the front of the tube. As with our other vacuform wraps, again we're going to take thin CA glue and apply it to the edge of the wrap and let it wick in, and then wipe it off. And we'll do this to both the front and the back of both of the wraps. And then do the edges as you did before. We're now ready to install the tunnel covers on the third stage body tube. For these, we will just use regular thick CA glue, and as before, just run a bead of glue on the back side and stick it down firmly against the body tube, right into the correct position on the tube. The smaller tunnel cover is positioned to the left of the larger one, and again we'll just glue it down with thick CA glue. The ohms pods and the ullage motors need to be sanded prior to installation. On the ohms pods, we'll sand the back end with some fine sandpaper. We'll also sand the bottom to make sure that it's flat, so that we can glue it down against the rocket. The ullage motors also need to be sanded flat. The ohms pods are glued to the flat section on the aft vacuform wrap of the third stage. Just put a bead of CA glue along the back side of the pod and affix it to the location, and the back edge is aligned with the back edge of the vacuform wrap. And then there's another one exactly on the opposite side of the rocket. The first ullage motor is glued on the stringers next to these two details on the vacuform wrap. If you count over 2 stringers, the ullage motor will straddle these two, and the front edge is 1/2 inch from the edge of the vacuform wrap. So we'll go ahead and mark that now. and it will be positioned right there. And again, we'll just use thick CA glue on the back side. The other ullage motor nozzle is next to the big tunnel on the tube. Again, we'll skip one stringer and then it will straddle the next two, and again the front is 1/2 inch back from the leading edge. And again, we'll use thick CA to glue it into position.
We're going to build the upper portion of the Apollo rocket. Start by locating the service module body tube. It is the tube which the capsule fits into.
Using your ruler, mark the body tube as indicated on the instruction sheet. Draw a line around the perimeter of the tube at this location. Use your aluminum angle to make the mark. Next, remove the rings from the die-cut sheet. These are the rings that fit over the service module body tube and into the tube for the S4B stage. In one of the centering rings, what we want to do is to cut 2 notches into the ring on the inside perimeter, approximately like this. These rings will allow the shock cord mount to come out of the ring on the bottom of the tube. Using your hobby knife, cut the notches. From the length of shock cord, cut a piece of shock cord 18 inches long. Take some wood glue and rub it into the ends of the fibers to keep them from fraying. Take the ring with the notches in it and glue it onto the body tube at the location where you marked the line. Use wood glue for this. On the outside, put a fillet of glue. Use your finger to spread this fillet out to make it thin so that it dries quickly. Make sure you don't clog the holes where you made the notches. Then put it aside to allow it to dry. Take the shock cord from before that you cut previously and thread one end through each of the notches you made in the centering rings. Then crisscross them around the backside and tie them into a knot. And pull the knot tight. Then pull on this end of the shock cord to bring the shock cord on the inside up against the ring. Then lay a fillet of glue along that shock cord. Spread it around with your finger. Give a final tug on that cord to make sure it's up tight against that centering ring, and then allow this to dry. Locate the coupler tube from the box of parts. It is the same diameter as the S4B stage tube, but it is only 1.5 inches long. Again, using your aluminum angle, mark a line along the length of this tube. We're going to cut this tube along that line. Use a sharp hobby knife to make this cut. Do several light passes and then do some thicker cuts until you're all the way through. Be careful, this is a difficult cut to make. Curl this tube inward and stick it into the S4B stage tube. And then separate it so that it fits snugly into the tube. Where it overlaps along the bottom, take your pencil and run it along that edge. Now take a ruler and we're going to cut that piece from the inside. This is an easier cut to make than cutting on the outside. Don't discard this little piece. We're going to use it to join the tube back together. Put a small bead of glue along this inside edge. Spread it around with your finger. With the glue that remains on your finger, put it on one edge of the spare piece and spread it around. And take that piece and put it back on the inside of the coupler tube so that it sticks halfway in and halfway out. If you use just a little bit of glue, it should dry fairly quickly. When it does, put a little bit more glue on the other side, spread it around with your finger, And what sticks on your finger, put on the inside and spread it around. And then join them back together along the line. And hold it there for a second while wiping off the excess glue that squirts out the outside. You may want to insert it back into the S4B stage tube to allow it to dry. As you can see, it slides nicely in and out of the tube. We're next going to glue the remaining centering ring onto the short coupler tube that we had spliced back together. When we glue this on here, we want to make sure that it is centered around the edges of this coupler tube. Start by putting just a thin bit of glue on that edge of the coupler tube. And smear it around with your finger on the inside and the outside. Now take the centering ring and position it onto the coupler. And make sure that the edges are aligned before pressing hard on the coupler tube. Hold it in position until the glue sets. If any glue squeezes out, wipe it off now. We don't want any glue on the outside. After the glue has set for a little while, we're going to put a fillet of glue on the inside perimeter. And spread it around with your finger. Be careful not to push too hard that you pop the centering ring off of the coupler tube. Just spread it around evenly. And set this aside to dry. After the glue has dried on the coupler tube and the centering ring, we're going to glue the coupler tube to this centering ring. Again, when we glue it, we want to make sure that all the edges are flush. Start by putting a layer of glue on the outside edge. Wipe off any glue that squeezes out so that there's no glue on the outside. Also put a fillet on this edge of the centering ring. And spread it around with your finger. After the glue on the rings is dry, we want to check the fit into the body tube. At this point, it's probably pretty tight. That is because there is some ring that overlaps the outside of the coupler. This we want to sand off. Take your sanding block and some coarse sandpaper, and we're going to sand towards the coupler. If we sand away from the coupler, we're going to delaminate the paper ring. So sand off any of the ring that sticks over the edge of the coupler tube. And do this for both the front and the back. Once the edges have been sanded down, it should slide in and out of the tube easily. But I want to go back and saturate the edges of the rings with some very thin super glue. Buy the thinnest brand you can and use a wick applicator. And carefully just let the liquid wick into the paper fibers. If you get any on the coupler tube, just wipe it off. And do this for both of the rings. After this glue has dried, go ahead and just sand it with some light sandpaper just to clean up the edges. The transition wrap on the rocket is actually made from two separate transitions, an internal one and the external one, which is embossed. We'll start by assembling the internal transition. From the pattern sheet, we're going to cut out the internal transition. Start by cutting the edge lines. Use a ruler and a sharp hobby knife. Now we'll cut the edge lines here. Just work slowly and keep your knife straight up and down. And cut the overlap at the short line. Carefully pre-curl the transition. Roll it, but do not kink the paper. We're going to glue the overlap piece to the inside edge of the transition, and we want to center it right in the middle. That's why it's a little bit shorter. But we do not want to use regular wood glue or white glue. We only want to use rubber cement on this because wood glue is brittle and it'll leave the transition with a high point, where the rubber cement is flexible and it will allow this to curve naturally around the curvature of the rocket. Rubber cement is easy to work with. Just take the little brush and paint a thin coat of rubber cement on the overlap and on the edges of the transition. You don't want to use much, just a thin coat. And one thing about rubber cement is that it does not stick until the glue is actually dry. So take a look at the rubber cement, and when the glaze of the glue is gone, which means it's not shiny, the rubber is dry and it can be assembled. So we'll just wait a few minutes. When the glue is dry, carefully peel it up from the table and put it carefully onto the transition. and just press down and it will stick. Then carefully roll the transition, and we're going to come in at an angle. Line up that top edge and then the bottom edge, and then allow the transition to flex upward and just press down with your thumbs. And the transition is still flexible. If you misposition the transition, you can simply peel it off, put more rubber cement on, and then reattach it. That's the beauty of rubber cement. It gives you the option of repositioning the parts. And when you're done, it should fit nicely onto the tube. The final transition is a little bit flexible. If you want to stiffen it up, I'll show you two ways to do this. The first way is an optional method of putting a ring inside the transition. From the instruction manual, print out the page with the optional centering ring. After you print it out, measure this to make sure it's exactly 1 inch long. Otherwise, adjust the printer settings and reprint the pattern sheet. Cut the ring out of the paper. We're going to glue this ring to a piece of cardboard. I found some cardboard from a cereal box. The quickest way to do this is just to use rubber cement. After the rubber cement is dried, just tack it down to the cardboard. And then using your hobby knife, cut the ring out of the cardboard. Next, we want to put a notch on the outside edge of the centering ring so that it will fit over the overlap on the inside of the transition. Also, on the inside of the transition, take your finger and rub along the inside to remove any of the rubber cement that might have oozed out. And take your hobby knife and cut out this little notch. We want to test fit the ring onto the body tube. If it's tight, we're going to want to sand the inside edge of the ring. I want a very loose fit on this ring. Next, take the transition section and slide it over the ring and line up the overlap with the notch you made in the ring. Using a hobby knife or a dowel, gently push the ring as far down into the transition as it will go. But do not try to push it too hard that you'll create a ridge on the outside of the transition. And slowly pull it off of the tube. After the ring has been removed and is positioned in the transition, we're going to glue it in place using super glue. Ordinarily, I would suggest using wood glue, but this time, when the wood glue dries, it will shrink, and it will pull in a little divot on the outside of the wrap. So we're going to use super glue because it does not shrink as it dries. And just tack it in place about every inch or so. Finally, come back and lay a bead of glue down to make a fillet on the inside of the tube.
Sliding the paper cone over the edge can be difficult. To make this easier, I want to bevel this edge inward. We'll do this with some sandpaper and a sanding block. As you can see, now it fits nicely over the edge of the adapter tube. You can rotate it a little bit if you're having a problem getting it over the edge, and that seems to center it up nicely. At this point, we're now ready to glue it into place. We're going to use the thin CA glue again. Start at the top edge and just let the CA wick underneath the paper. And if any CA is on the tube, just wipe it off. And then do the same for the bottom side. Now we're going to stiffen up this wrap by coating it with CA glue. The CA just wicks into the fibers and stiffens up the whole thing. You may want to do this step outdoors, as the CA, when it sets off, it creates a lot of fumes that could irritate your eyes. You can see the CA wicks nicely into the paper. Just kind of paint it on. If there's any excess, wipe it off before it kicks off. We now have the entire surface covered with the super glue, and it has now cured. Now we want to come back and we want to sand it smooth with some medium grit sandpaper. I also like the sanding pads with the foam on the back because they conform a little bit nicer to the curvature of the tube. can feel it with your finger if it is smooth. If it's not, just keep sanding. I now have the entire surface sanded, and it's now ready for the embossed wrap to go over the top of it. Once it is sealed with the CA glue, it is quite strong, much more rigid than it was without the CA glue. We're now going to cut out the embossed wrap. This is a critical step in the construction of the rocket. What you're going to do is cut just on the outside edge of the raised area on the embossed wrap. For the straight lines, use a metal ruler. Lay the ruler on top of the embossed wrap so if your blade strays away from the ruler, it doesn't mar the surface of the embossed wrap. Make sure you use a sharp hobby knife. For the curve part, just carefully align your blade to the edge of the raised area on the wrap. Work slowly and keep a steady hand. Next, I want to take the embossed wrap and test fit it around the transition section. There's a line on the transition section you can use to align the wrap. After you have it around the tube, carefully note the distance that the wrap sticks over the edge of the internal transition. I want to mark that with a pencil. I next want to spray the backside of the embossed wrap with a spray adhesive. This will hold the wrap in place while we glue it. I only want to use a very light coat. That's enough adhesive to make it stick. And at the same time, it will allow us to reposition it if necessary. Use the pencil lines you made previously to align it in the correct position. Gently press it down and roll it around the tube and align the edges in place. If it doesn't line up, carefully unwrap it and reposition. To glue it into place, I'm going to use the CA glue again, that's very thin, and I'm just going to tack down the edges. Just allow the CA to wick underneath. Be very careful not to get any CA glue on the surface, because you will not be able to sand this without ruining the embossed wrap. we're going to carefully put just a little CA on that seam line, just to tack it down. And then hold it in place while the CA sets. The reason I want to glue it down is because any paint you put on the top is going to soften up the spray adhesive underneath and will make the edges lift up. So by gluing them down, it will be permanent. We also want to do the seam first before doing the bottom edge, because if we do the bottom edge first and it's out of position, it will cause this seam to pucker up in places. I'm now ready to do the bottom edge, and again we'll just come in with the CA glue and just let it wick underneath. From the die cut rings, you'll find a solid disc. This is glued to the bottom of the transition section. Just use ordinary wood glue around the edge, stick it in place, and hold it there until the glue dries. You can also put a fillet of glue around the edge to make this a strong joint. The next step in assembling the upper portion of the rocket is to apply the wrap for the service module. This wrap features raised ink, so that when you paint the surface, this ink will show through, giving you a lot of surface detail. Before we can apply the wrap, we need to know how it is oriented with respect to the transition wrap. We'll use the seam on the wrap to orient this wrap here. We're going to cut out the service module positioning guide from the internal transition pattern sheet. Go ahead and cut this out with a ruler and a hobby knife. You'll notice on the pattern sheet there's two arrows. One arrow on this edge is to be aligned with the seam of the transition. Here's your transition, and then here's the seam where the two edges come together. So start by pre-curling this pattern sheet. And align the edge that goes to the seam of the transition like this, and roll it around, and on the other end we're going to draw a line along this edge. This line will be used to align the edges of the service module wrap. Next we can go ahead and cut out the service module wrap.
I want to gently pre-curl this, just roll it up loosely. And then we're going to spray the back side with a light coat of the spray adhesive. Again, the spray adhesive just allows us to hold it in position on the rocket. Taking our transition section, we'll align the bottom edge of the service module wrap against the transition section here. Put this edge up against the line and wrap it around the rocket. The edges should come together nicely. Now we're going to glue the edges down using the thin super glue. On the top side, we're just going to allow it to wick on the very edge, and it will wick underneath the paper and hold it down. Now we'll do the bottom edge. Lastly, we'll do along the seam. Use care doing this seam because we do not want to get any glue on the surface of the rocket.